With Australia and the world now facing an energy crisis, suddenly nuclear is no longer a dirty word. Increasingly, European nations are embracing it as an emissions-free option. And here in Australia, the question now is this: faced with soaring electricity prices and supply problems, why not seriously think about going nuclear? Well, this is why we should. Nuclear energy scares many people. But are those fears reasonable?
We could produce all of our energy from nuclear right now. The main obstacle is really psychological.
I think there's a lot of confusion. I think people have for a long time confused energy with weapons.
The actual industries, the way the power plants work, it really has nothing to do with nuclear weapons.
If we're going to get to net zero emissions by 2050, it would require a transformation of our energy system on a scale that's never before occurred.
Do you believe that nuclear energy is vital for Australia's future?
I think it's vital for the world's future.
The younger generation is being brought up in a world where climate change is front and centre.
If we had embraced nuclear technology decades ago, we would not have climate change.
Everybody's talking about it. The climate challenge, how to get to net zero. To do that, we need to stop burning fossil fuels like coal and gas because they pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But do we have the alternatives that can do that and supply our energy needs by 2050? Are we ignoring the one proven, reliable and emissions-free power source, nuclear? Every mother wants a safe, healthy and prosperous future for her child.
I want her to breathe clean air. I want her to not suffer through devastating impacts of climate change. And if we're going to move away from coal and if we care about climate change, the only technology that we currently have today which can replace that fossil fuel generation is nuclear energy. We have every reason to be able to develop nuclear energy capabilities in the future and to be able to have nuclear energy as an option. But we need to start that work now. And a little button nose.
By the time little Georgina is 30 years old, we're told she'll be living in a net zero carbon emissions world. But how?
Oh, yeah.
So you would see nuclear energy as underpinning your daughter's future rather than threatening it?
Most definitely, and I think the benefit of nuclear as well is that it's not just going to be probably her generation, because you build a nuclear power plant and it's probably going to be on for 60 to 80 years.
Whether you love coal or loathe it, worry about the planet or not, there's no avoiding the push for clean energy. World bodies, national governments, state and local administrations, political parties of all stripes, big business, they're all committing to net zero. And most of them pretend we can get there with renewable energy, mainly solar and wind.
We believe in net zero emissions here at the City of Newcastle. We can do this with different energy sources like renewables, offshore wind, hydrogen power. We don't need nuclear.
But increasingly, other environmental campaigners insist this is just not possible.
No, we cannot do it with renewable energy alone. A key part of protecting the natural environment for my children is nuclear energy. That is just a fact. Nuclear energy is clean, it's reliable, and if we embrace it now, we can combat climate change and benefit generations to come.
Newcastle in New South Wales is the world's largest coal exporting port. So in the energy debate, it's ground zero.
There's been a real dearth of leadership in terms of policy in dealing with climate change, in dealing with the net zero emission targets. And what you have seen is local government fill that gap. And the City of Newcastle has been a leader in that field.
Nuatali Nelms is with the Labor Party. As the Coal City's mayor, she promotes Newcastle's green credentials. As a Labor mayor, you're committed to Australia and the world getting to net zero by 2050, yet you want to keep a coal exporting industry?
Yeah, the juxtaposition is real, but we are literally at the coalface of what is happening in terms of energy, not just in Australia, but around the world. So we absolutely recognise that coal will see out my lifetime. But that doesn't mean you cannot protect those jobs and have a plan for the future.
But how does Australia or the world get to net zero by 2050 with all that coal going out of the port?
So everyone, I think, needs to take responsibility for their own actions. And we have our own net zero emissions targets by 2030 for our own operations here at the City of Newcastle.
It just does my head in how big this challenge is, how many solar farms you would have to build to replace just one day's exports from this port.
There is not going to be one energy source that completely replaces the energy sources we have now. And that is why we needed leadership decades ago to actually have a plan that transitions us over generations. That's what would have been sensible. We are playing catch up now, and we are a little bit behind the 8 ball.
Her city was founded on coal, fuelled by coal, and is still dependent on the coal fields of the Hunter Valley. But Mayor Nelms believes in renewables. She's proud of how this small solar farm supplies most of the council's electricity. So is it you doing your bit, or is it just a gesture?
So for us here, it's about meeting our own targets to reduce our emissions. And imagine if every local government area, every organisation had their own targets in place, we would meet not only the 2030 goal that we've set in Newcastle, but a national 2050 goal.
There are no easy answers when it comes to replacing coal. Coal trains supply this port 24/7. Each train carriage carrying about 100 tonnes of coal. Thousands of ships export about 400 million tonnes of Australian coal every year to China, Japan, South Korea, where it's used to make steel and generate electricity. That's enough coal to produce double Australia's annual greenhouse gas emissions, or enough to largely power 3 countries the size of Australia. Replacing that amount of energy is a massive challenge. How on earth can you get Australia to net zero with wind turbines and solar farms? It just can't be done with the existing technology, can it?
Well, you tap into the hydrogen as a fuel source, and you also have to tap into all the other fuel sources as well.
Except nuclear.
I do not support nuclear.
But why not nuclear?
Because of the risk reward. You have to look at the short-term benefits do not, I see, outweigh the long-term risks.
We've got around 16 coal plants in the national electricity market at the moment, and 8 of those are predicted to come to the end of their natural lives in the next decade or so.
After almost 2 decades of subsidies and investment, renewable energy projects now dot our landscape. This wind farm near Goulburn in New South Wales is one of several in the area. There are more than 100 wind farms spread right across Australia. They've been subsidised by the market and they've cost about $15 billion. But they supply less than 10% of Australia's electricity. To supply the lion's share, we'd need 900, perhaps 1,000 wind farms spread right around Australia. And even then, if the wind was blowing nowhere, we'd need something else to power Australia.
What we do know is we're going to need increasingly flexible generation types to be able to cope with times when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. We need agile technologies to support electricity generation.
To find out how the energy companies think they can do it, we've come to Sarah McNamara, Chief Executive of the Energy Council. We've spent something like $40 billion on hundreds of large-scale renewable energy projects, and we've got to less than a quarter of our electricity share. So how much more investment and how many more large-scale renewable projects are we going to need to get to net zero?
We don't have an exact figure, but we are seeing state governments planning to invest huge amounts of money in renewable energy zones to build more large-scale wind and solar.
Another energy source Australia has in enviable quantities is sunlight. Large-scale solar is now generating lots of hype and investment because Australia has abundant clear skies and space for vast installations. So it brings into question the key point for renewables, energy storage. Obviously it's easy, especially in this country, to generate renewable energy, but batteries simply can't store enough of that electricity, can they?
Batteries have a certain capability. They're not yet at the point where batteries with renewables will be able to drive our electricity market on their own. But we do expect batteries will play an increasingly important role in the future. But at the moment, they are not a silver bullet technology to back up renewables.
We're so dependent on fossil fuels right now that we must find successful alternatives. And if we can't do that, then we're going to leave a legacy of increasing problems for the future society.
Professor Barry Brook from the University of Tasmania is one of Australia's leading environmental academics. Is net zero globally by 2050 realistic, and can we achieve that?
The scale's enormous, absolutely enormous. Humanity on Earth is emitting over 30 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. If we're going to get to net zero emissions by 2050, then it would require a transformation of our energy system on a scale that's never before occurred.
Brook is one of a growing number of environmentalists around the world turning to proven nuclear technology as the green answer. Isn't nuclear energy the silver bullet?
It's the heavy metal uranium bullet, but yeah, I think it is a solution that could potentially be essentially the one fix. And that's something that's uncomfortable to a lot of environmentalists or even scientists in general. It's been proven to do the job in a number of nations already. It could potentially do the whole job, but it doesn't need to do the whole job. It could do the heavy lifting, and that would allow for other energy sources where appropriate to also contribute. If we're going to get to net zero emissions, we're almost certainly going to have an energy mix which is more diverse than today.
It's a monumental task, but we're very lucky that we have solutions.
Xeon Lights is a British eco-campaigner who once ran with the Extinction Rebellion radicals. But now she's changed direction.
It's no good just telling people all the time that things are bad and this is a bad thing that's happening and you should just feel bad. That's actually a really bad motivator for change anyway. So I think that they've lost their way a little bit, and that was part of my, departure from that group.
You are a campaigning environmentalist. You're on a mission to save the planet.
Yeah, I am. Doesn't everybody care about the planet? It's the only known habitable planet in our universe. Doesn't everybody care about that?
Can we reduce those emissions and supply energy for the people of the world through renewable energy?
No, we cannot do it with renewable energy alone.
A mother of 2 daughters, Raven and Arwen, Xeon is determined they'll have both the energy for secure lives and a healthy planet.
A key part of protecting the natural environment for my children is nuclear energy. That is just a fact, yes.
But the environmental movement globally has fought against nuclear energy for the past 50 or 60 years.
Yes, it has, unfortunately, and it's time for that to change.
Is it changing?
It is changing, yeah. I find that younger people are very, very open to any solution that's presented to them because they're very worried about climate change. They want to see solutions, and they don't tend to be anti-tech like the kind of older boomer generation of environmentalists who, you know, they're all about living with less and using less. But frankly, those environmentalists have failed us. If we had embraced nuclear technology decades ago, we would not have climate change.
Immersing herself in nuclear advocacy, Xeon last year swam with fellow activists next to the Sizewell B reactor in the UK.
The idea of swimming in the water was just to try and unpick this pop culture idea of these places are dangerous and you can't go near them, you know, and the water's radioactive. This is actually a myth that has been perpetuated by green groups for a long time. Things like the water's radioactive. No, it's not. We went and swam in there. It was perfectly good water.
And this year she toured the huge new nuclear reactor Hinkley C in Somerset.
It is steel. You've got the inner containment, which is a concrete structure, and then the outer containment, which is a concrete structure.
So I've had an excellent tour of Hinkley Point C. It's been very informative, and I have to say I'm very impressed with what I've seen.
We need to stop building, and this kind of goes against what traditional environmentalism kind of stands for, but it's the only way out, it's the only solution. And actually, let's be honest, if you're building huge solar farms or huge wind turbines, that's building. So I don't see why that's okay and that's seen as green, but nuclear energy isn't.
So tell me why the environmental movement has been so anti-nuclear for so long.
I think there's a lot of confusion. I think people have for a long time confused energy with weapons, and it kind of, the environmental movement was kind of born around that time out of the kind of, you know, Cold War era, lots of worry about weapons, and people who have lived through that are some of the most prominent vocal environmentalists. So they just hear nuclear and they just shut down, they just think of bombs. Once that fear is there, it's very hard to get rid of that, it's very hard to unpick that.
I definitely think a huge amount of the fear stems from its association with nuclear weapons. There's no doubt about it. They share the same name. The same basic process of splitting atoms to release heat is the same process. The actual industries, the way the power plants work, the way that they operate, it really has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. They're two totally different parts of our society.
A lot of you already know my history as previously an anti-nuclear campaigner. I'm sorry. Pardon. And now I'm here trying to make amends for that, trying to fix that.
In England and across Europe, Xeon is surprising fellow green activists and other citizens with this impassioned call for nuclear power.
Nations and individuals cannot be ruled by anti-scientific rhetoric. This has to stop. This spells the end of humanity.
The problem with nuclear is all the technology is bad. Waste, radiation, Chernobyl, Fukushima. Well, why is Fukushima bad? Nobody died there because of the nuclear power plant. But it doesn't matter because it has that hold on people. So we're going to go out and say it's clean, it's abundant, it's a gift. You know, and all of the nice things. And there will be people who come along and say, you're industry funded. And I'll say, no, we're not. The industry needs to get off its bum and do the work so that we don't have to do it. They have a good, clean product that it should be selling around the world the way that fossil fuel companies sell their products, which is very clever and very powerful. France in the 70s, they decided to build lots of nuclear power plants. They did not do this for climate purposes. It wasn't really a thing then. They did it for energy independence. They didn't want to have to get their gas from, Russia or Norway or wherever. They did it for energy independence. They had a very good energy security policy. It provided lots of jobs, strengthened the economy. And now, decades later, they have the cleanest emissions of Europe and some of the cleanest emissions in the world.
You'd be aware that Australia is one of the largest exporters of fossil fuels, coal and natural gas, but also of uranium. Does it surprise you that Australia doesn't do anything more with its own uranium?
It does surprise me. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. It doesn't quite make sense. I mean, you could be a world leader in showing how things are done. If you really want to stick it to the boomer environmentalists who are telling us all to live with less, you could show them how you can create a decarbonised future that still gives everybody abundant energy, high quality of life, but just isn't causing climate change.
All we're talking about is a source of energy that produces steam. You're just making your steam from a different energy source.
The issue for the storage of waste is it's there for hundreds of generations, and that's a big issue for people to get their head around.
I think it's vital for the world's future. I think that we're discovering this all the time.
There they are playing. Wow. So a bunch of us have been speaking out about this. A lot of us who used to be big advocates for renewables came to understand the limits of renewables. We now understand that we need nuclear power.
This is the Diablo Canyon nuclear reactor on the California coast.
So it's quite a striking sight, given all of the misinformation we've been subjected to see so much abundant wildlife flocking to this nuclear power plant. As you might imagine, this is one of the most heavily studied nuclear plants in the world. They have an on-site ecologist. They do nature trips for school children. When I visited, I went to see it myself. They grow pasture beef within a stone's throw from the plant.
They don't have two heads?
Everybody is doing very healthy. There's no three-eyed fish.
Environmentalist Michael Schellenberger has jumped ship. He was once on board with the anti-nuclear movement. Was that you in the past? Were you initially opposed to nuclear energy?
Oh, absolutely. I was raised to be anti-nuclear, like a lot of people in my generation. Came of age in the 1980s when there was a lot of fear of nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we really viewed nuclear as something almost demonic, something really quite dangerous and terrifying.
B-29 bombers were visiting the empire of the rising sun with ruthless regularity. But it took only one B-29, the Enola Gay, to close that chapter in human history.
It's more than 75 years since the US ended the Second World War by using nuclear bombs against Japan. Now, the global warming debate has forced one-time anti-nuclear activists to consider the urgent need for reliable, clean energy.
There's always a period of time where people need to get accustomed to the new technology. The truth is that we could produce all of our energy from nuclear right now. The main obstacle is really psychological. It's ideological, political obstacle. The existing technology is really quite good. We've been using it for over 60 years. The most important thing with nuclear is the same thing that's been important with jet planes. We have very similar jet planes that we had right after World War II, actually, in the 1940s and 50s. But they've gotten better over time, and the people operating them and maintaining them and building them have gotten better at their jobs. Similarly, with nuclear, we've gotten so much better at operating these machines.
Nuclear energy scares many people. But are those fears reasonable? Helen Cook is a good person to ask.
Beautiful girl.
For 15 years as an international lawyer, she's advised governments and companies around the world on nuclear power.
When I left Australia in 2007, I knew nothing about nuclear energy, and I think that's probably reflective of my generation generally in Australia. And so it was an eye-opening experience to me to learn that there was this energy source that we didn't have in Australia and that a lot of countries in the world utilise, and some countries utilise to a very large percentage of their energy mix.
It's a big challenge to the established thinking, isn't it, to talk about nuclear really as the green option?
It is. It is. And yet nuclear is the best green option we have in terms of baseload energy. Absolutely.
But Australia has a tangled history with all things nuclear. Back in the 50s, Maralinga in outback South Australia was a testing ground for British atomic bombs. In the 80s and 90s, the development of Australian uranium mines generated political conflict and widespread protests. There are three key fears people have about nuclear energy. There's weapons, waste, and accidents. Are they legitimate fears?
If we talk about accidents, obviously I'm aware that we've had 3 major accidents that have received wide publicity globally: 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl and Fukushima. 3 Mile Island, we know that there were no deaths associated with 3 Mile Island. Chernobyl, the most reputable sources say deaths associated with either the workers who were at the plant initially, so the frontline workers in the first 24 hours of the accident, that there were some deaths there, and of course that there have been a few deaths linked to thyroid cancer directly due to the radiation exposure.
The UN's Scientific Radiation Committee found the Chernobyl radiation toll was far lower than early fears. 28 workers dying from exposure in the initial tragedy and 15 people from related cancer.
But I think most people would be shocked to hear that statistic of deaths associated with the Chernobyl accident. And then we move to Fukushima. You know, that's something that obviously happened within our recent memory, and it might be a controversial statement to make, but I believe that Fukushima actually demonstrates how safe nuclear energy is.
The Japanese government has said several Fukushima workers suffered radiation effects and that one worker died in 2018 due to lung cancer.
But the World Health Organization has said that there are no deaths directly attributed to the Fukushima accident, and that there currently are no and not expected to be any long-term radiological impacts on human health or environment.
In a small way, Australia has been nuclear since the 1950s. Australia has a nuclear reactor. It's operated here at Lucas Heights on the southern fringes of Sydney for 7 decades. It operates day and night conducting research and supplying Australia's nuclear medicine industry. So here, right next to suburbia, a nuclear reactor operates safely, not threatening lives, but saving them.
I'm functionally somebody who refused to serve in the South African Defence Force, so I'm not a big fan of war.
Adi Patterson was sentenced to jail for refusing to put on a uniform. For the last 15 years, this pacifist ran Australia's nuclear reactor and research organisation.
I think if we can help people to see that uranium is not scary and that nuclear power is a clean, safe and efficient way of dealing with a lot of these things, we'd have a better narrative for our future in energy.
Australia is an energy-rich country with massive amounts of coal and gas, not to mention renewable resources. Why on earth would we go down a nuclear path?
So we can use sunlight, we can use wind, and we can use this embedded high energy source, thorium or uranium. And we have got all of those in abundance. So from a perspective of international leadership, the idea would be then to get the lowest carbon mix out of the three of those that supported the type of nation that we want to be globally. And the lowest carbon mix must include a nuclear fuel source.
Can you even get to net zero by using renewables and energy storage?
I don't believe that it is possible. You know, I think there's a hazard in suggesting that that is a good method if you've got a better one available. So even if it was a plausible pathway, would you not go for the lowest cost, lowest footprint outcome?
Do you believe that nuclear energy is vital for Australia's future?
I think it's vital for the world's future. I think that we're discovering this all the time. I would say if we want the future that we're talking about, which is a future that is a low-carbon future, that honours the earth that we're living in, and honours the future generations who will have to take over from us, we would absolutely have a nuclear future.
Australia even has legislation that bans nuclear power. Is it unique to have a country like Australia where nuclear energy is illegal?
Let's take the G20. Australia is the only G20 country that has a prohibition on nuclear energy and is not currently considering, nor has it historically considered seriously, nuclear energy.
Former Minister for Resources, Keith Pitt, has been pushing in federal parliament for what he calls an adult conversation about nuclear power.
Yeah, the message here, mate, is pretty straightforward. Technology has moved. It's like trying to compare the old FJ Holden with what's happening now with a Tesla, for example. Things have really moved on. I think this is a part of the debate that we really need to get across to a number of people, but particularly the Australian people. All we're talking about is a source of energy that produces steam. The rest of the generation piece is exactly the same as an existing coal-fired power station. You're just making your steam from a different energy source.
The paradox is that for decades we've been digging up uranium. Australia is the third biggest producer in the world. In 2016, former South Australian Governor, retired Rear Admiral Kevin Scarce, ran a royal commission into prospects for a nuclear power and waste disposal industry. How big a problem would waste disposal be?
Look, waste disposal is a significant problem, but already we've seen around the world geological storage, deep geological storage being activated. We have the perfect climate here, the perfect seismic inactivity. We've got areas of a nation with no underground water.
Your study actually looked at nuclear waste as an opportunity, both for financial reasons and energy reasons.
Yes, I think the issue for the storage of waste is it's there for hundreds of generations, and that's a big issue for people to get their head around. And you wouldn't do it, A, unless you needed to, and B, unless there was some benefit arising from it. I think both of those things would be applicable for Australia. There are many nations that don't have a safe repository for long-term storage. If the people of the nation felt that it was appropriate, we could do it, and we could do it safely.
I'm quite optimistic about nuclear waste. There are technologies that are becoming available using accelerated technology and some very clever nuclear chemistry, where I think from about 2045 we will be able to reprocess practically all the nuclear waste that exists in the world. And in the case of the fuel, we will then generate fuel for the next period of time that can be reused.
The farming town of Kimber on South Australia's Eyre Peninsula has become a testing ground, grasping a role in our nuclear future.
So most of the waste is coming from Lucas Heights. Right.
It's a wonderful opportunity for our community and something that really is important for Australia.
Jeff Baldock is a third-generation farmer out here. He's volunteered to store Australia's low-level nuclear waste on his property.
Our family owns the Napani property where Australia's radioactive waste facility will hopefully be situated. We have all of our children home on the farm with us. We have 8 grandkids coming along. I see this as a wonderful opportunity to give them a chance of employment and a good life here in Kimber.
The federal government ran a poll to give the people of Kimber a say on the project.
This is a community for which there was more than 60% support. It's a wheat farm, it's cleared, it's remote, it meets all of the technical and feasibility pieces that you would need for this facility, and yet it's taken 6 years, $60 million and a lot of pain and angst, and it's not finished yet.
There are still vocal opponents.
I'm a member of the No Radioactive Waste on Agricultural Land in Kimber RSA committee. Our committee is opposed to the siting of the National Radioactive Waste Management Facility in the Kimber district. We believe the federal government should be looking for the best possible site for this facility and that is not on farming land.
Tell us about that emotive reaction to nuclear waste.
I mean, there's a whole lot of things that get thrown up, all of which have been disproven. Now, whether that's the impact on local agriculture and what will happen in terms of their ability to export to other markets. Well, if you go to Champagne in France, that's where their repository is in France, right next to some of the the most well-known production for grapes and others in the world. So it's a nonsense argument.
This is the corner of our property here. We're within the 10 kilometres from the Pandy.
There is opposition there as well, of course. There are some vocal opponents. What do they fear from this waste that is currently stored all around the country in hospitals?
Well, the biggest fear is always the fear of the unknown. It's predominantly waste from nuclear medicine, so it's gowns, it's gloves, it's needles and bits and pieces. There's very little that comes from elsewhere. But the facility itself, Chris, is absolutely necessary. I mean, this is a piece of national infrastructure, and on most recent advice, every single Australian will utilise nuclear medicine to prolong their life, to help them treat cancer, to identify cancer. And yet it took months of negotiations to get the opposition on board just to support it. And even then, it was done in a way which was not ideal, but we got an outcome.
But if it's such a struggle just to get to this point with our relatively tiny repository for low-level, mainly medical waste, will Australia ever consider its own nuclear energy program? If people had the choice and they were sitting on their back veranda looking out across the valley, do you think they'd rather see across the other side of the valley a coal-fired power station, a wind turbine farm, or a modern nuclear reactor?
To be frank, Chris, I don't think they like any of them.
They just want the juice.
That's exactly right. Not in my backyard. And this becomes the fundamental problem. Look, I think that those challenges are solvable, but not in the short or medium term. It takes a very significant strategy. It'll take a lot of political courage and leadership. And look, unless there is bipartisan support, I just don't see that happening.
Nuclear power can deliver large amounts of power day and night.
There's no reason why we have to design a power plant that looks like a power plant.
I don't think that we should be pursuing that type of technology when you have the options that don't have that type of risk.
It needs to be one of those technologies we consider. We shouldn't be afraid to ask the question.
Rolls-Royce. Throughout the last century, this luxury vehicle has established itself as the pinnacle of fine engineering. Yes, it's been part of our carbon-chugging past, but today, this world-renowned prestige brand is working on our nuclear future. Just look at what's up ahead. This is it. They're smaller than traditional fixed reactors that are built on site, and they're modular, meaning they're a standard design produced in a factory. The small modular reactor, perhaps coming soon to an electricity grid near you.
It is designed to be architecturally beautiful. Doesn't look like a normal power station. That's intentional. There's no reason why we have to design a power plant that looks like a power plant.
Alan Woods is Rolls-Royce Vice President of Strategy and Business.
Rolls-Royce is doing an enormous amount across its whole product portfolio in R&D to decarbonise our products and produce the next generation of products which will fit in a net zero world.
It's fascinating, actually, because most people are familiar with Rolls-Royce as the maker of the most prestigious cars and of jet engines, but this is a big focus for your future now?
Yeah, SMR is a big focus, but Rolls-Royce isn't new to nuclear. We've been designing, manufacturing and even operating small nuclear power plants for 60 years, and that's all in the defence side of our business for the UK Royal Navy, so we're not foreigners to nuclear.
Rolls-Royce has a worldwide plan for SMRs that includes Australia. As we shut down coal-fired power stations like this one in Port Augusta, SMRs could quickly replace them on site. My understanding is you could actually deliver to that site an SMR, connect it into the transmission grid and virtually flick the switch.
Yes, it is capable of fitting in with existing grid infrastructure and therefore replacing existing fossil fuel coal-fired power stations. And that's a real advantage because the grid costs can be expensive. So if you have a solution that can plug and play, you don't need to upgrade all of your grid to accommodate it, and it can fit in, replace that fossil fuel generation with a clean generation asset that will run for 60 years.
Internationally, a number of companies are designing small modular reactors.
Hi, I'm Bill Gates, Chairman and co-founder of TerraPower.
Microsoft founder Bill Gates has invested in the billion-dollar Natrium reactor project in the US.
15 years ago, I assembled a group of experts to explore the technologies necessary to solve the dual challenges of global energy poverty and climate change. It became clear that an essential tool to solving both is advanced nuclear power. Nuclear power is the only carbon-free energy source we have that can deliver large amounts of power day and night through every season, almost anywhere on Earth. And it's been proven to work on a large scale.
There are people like Bill Gates who've written extensively on it, and if we believe what they say, we have a huge, huge battle ahead of us. From my understanding, even the International Energy Agency is very supportive of nuclear, and it's actually called out countries that have said that they might not be replacing their existing nuclear, or they had plans to develop new nuclear and have decided not to go ahead with them. And the IEA has actually called them out and said, no, we think that you should be focusing on developing nuclear. And I think there is a growing recognition that we just don't have the technical capabilities in the solar panels, the wind farms and the batteries to achieve the deep decarbonisation that is needed if we want to make a dent in climate change.
Kevin Scarce's inquiry considered the merits of a nuclear industry for South Australia. How would you envisage small modular reactors being used in an Australian context?
Well, the benefit that they offer is they're smaller. The new versions don't go critical, so they have natural aspiration. They can fit more easily into the grid circuit, and hopefully they can be produced in a sort of mass way where the costs of it can be brought down to a fraction of what a large-scale nuclear reactor plant costs at the moment.
When you think about an Australian submarine powered by nuclear energy parking at Port Adelaide or in Sydney Harbour, surely it's going to help people become a little bit more practical about the use of nuclear energy.
Yeah, I think it certainly will, Chris, but let's put that in perspective. That's likely to be around 2035 to 2040. If we're going to solve our climate issue, we need to have a lot of action underway by then.
Is a Royal Commission the way to do that?
I think it is. It needs to be one of those technologies that we consider. We shouldn't be afraid to ask the question. We're not saying let's have nuclear. We're saying let's look at the technology and see if it meets our energy needs into the future.
Why would anybody be counting out nuclear, given that we know it's very reliable and certainly is emissions-free?
Well, we don't necessarily think you should count out nuclear, but be very cautious about the cost. Nuclear is hugely expensive and complicated. There is a long-standing community anxiety about nuclear in this country. At the moment, we just see it has too many hurdles to be overcome.
The latest opinion polls show more than half of Australians believe nuclear energy is at least worth consideration, but many remain fearful.
It has done a lot of damage, and that does not go away in one lifetime. It takes 100 lifetimes to deal with that type of nuclear waste. And until you've dealt with or have the technology to deal with nuclear accidents and nuclear waste, I don't think that we should be pursuing that type of technology into the future when you have the options of other mixes that don't have that type of risk.
Much of the hope for net zero carbon emissions is built on speculation. The International Energy Agency says almost half the planned reductions by 2050 are based on tech that's still only in demonstration or prototype phase. The agency says even with heavy use of solar and wind, we'll still need nuclear power. If you're talking about installing SMRs in a country, for instance, like Australia, what would you tell people about the safety provisions of such a plant and also what waste it would produce and how that would be dealt with?
Our plant is designed to take advantage of passive features. It has a 72-hour walk-away capability, so you could, in event of a complete loss of power, the plant can look after itself without any human intervention for 72 hours, and even then, all it needs is a top of water. So when you talk about the safety features, the reality is it's incredibly safe. From a waste perspective, yes, there's a lot of irrational commentary about the waste from SMRs as well. What I will say is regulation in the nuclear industry dictates that we have to demonstrate what we're going to do with all the waste product and how we're going to decommission the plant before we lay a spade in the ground. But there is a reality, which is you look at the waste from a nuclear plant, we don't plough it into the air, we don't throw it into the sea. It's all contained. It's safely stored in containers. You can walk around the containers. And the 60-year waste produced from our power plant would fit in less than half an Olympic swimming pool in its containerised form. It's completely safe. It's well understood how we store it. And that's the reality here. So nuclear power is the safest and cleanest form of energy generation historically, and it continues to be so. The problem we've got is it's only 4% of global energy. And that means that we've got a huge challenge. We need to increase that amount and renewables, because if we don't, all the other industries are putting the waste into the atmosphere, and they'll continue to do so, and that's unsustainable.
How significant would it be if Australia were to get rid of those legislative prohibitions?
I think it would be tremendously significant for a few reasons. First, as a lawyer or even as an ordinary citizen, I would expect laws that prohibit things to be doing so because they are unsafe or dangerous. And the facts and science behind nuclear energy simply don't stack up. But what these prohibitions do is that they reinforce or even create this fear of nuclear energy. So I think to overturn those prohibitions would be a huge signal to the Australian public that maybe we need to rethink our current thinking on nuclear.
Do you think younger people will be more willing to embrace nuclear energy?
The younger generation is being brought up in a world where climate change is front and centre. And when you look at the facts and the science and you look at the data and you compare all of the energy generation sources that we have, nuclear has such a good story to tell from a climate change perspective, but also enabling us to continue our current way of life and indeed improve it.
Covered in light, too strong a flame keeps me up at night. I'm too far gone now, I ain't thinking right. Pull me under till I don't miss the air.